All right, so the recording is started. Remember, there is evidence, so.
That's what I'm going to be using for my alibi. All right, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about creating engaging and inclusive news for your intranet. You know, keeping your employees informed is very important. The difference between an organization that fails under adversity or one that strives depends on an organization's ability to adapt quickly to changing business needs. So to quickly communicate to the right people in your organization will help ensuring that everyone is aware of what's happening and will help increasing adoption to change. And that can make all the difference. So today, Emily and I are going to show you how you can use SharePoint News and how it's a great way to communicate to your employees easily, but also how understanding how to create engaging and inclusive news using SharePoint can help you successfully convey your messages and get the results that you want. We have literally hours worth of material to cover, so we had to narrow it down. We would have loved to present mostly about how to efficiently write, but really what we're trying to cover today is really more about how to efficiently write for SharePoint using SharePoint features. And with that, I'd like to introduce Emily. Emily?
Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Mancini. I'm an architect over at Simpraxis Consulting, and I specialize in user experience. I am master certified with the Nielsen Norman Group in user experience, so you'll be hearing me reference a lot of their research throughout the whole presentation. If you're unfamiliar with them, they are the world leaders of user research, and I highly recommend them. We have a lot of links throughout this whole session, and then also at the end, they have really powerful articles to help you create engaging content. And before becoming a consultant, I was a Microsoft 365 platform owner and trainer. I was a team of one for a quickly growing company, so I also understand the pain points that these larger groups and some of these business owners are going through. And my wonderful co-presenter, Hugo.
Thank you. So my name is Hugo Bernier. I am a MVP, and I'm also a proud member of the Patterns and Practices team. And during the day, I'm an independent consultant. I'm a recovering management consultant with McKinsey & Company, but nowadays I like to call myself the world's laziest developer. If there's a way that I can avoid doing work and be more efficient in doing something, you can bet that I'll find a way. And a lot of what we'll be talking about today is really derived on things that I've done to try to avoid having to redo work more often and to be more efficient. So today, our agenda is in three major parts. We're going to be, we're going to be talking about leveraging SharePoint News because there's tons of features in SharePoint News that people don't know or don't know how to make the most of it. Then we're going to be talking about the best ways to convey your messages and most importantly, how to design your pages and consider things like accessibility. And then finally, we'll talk about how to get the results that you want with your news. And with that, we're going to get started with leveraging SharePoint News.
So for most companies right now, news is sent via email. But so is everything else. So news is getting lost in the sea of emails about action items. There's probably some ads that I didn't subscribe to, emails back and forth with my colleagues, as well as some company-wide announcements, department announcements. So it can be really challenging to get that engagement when something actually is critical. And email has a ton of limitations. There's no organizational memory. So if I'm a new employee, I have no idea what was emailed out last week for company news and what has been going on through the organization. There can be decreased engagement as it's one-way communication. There isn't a lot of ability for you to interact with the news sender without either spamming everyone or having a siloed conversation that no one else can see and benefit from. If you're using out-of-the-box email, there's really limited analytics, so you may not even know who is reading or consuming that news you sent. Notifications can also destroy a lot of the focus of your employees, so news popping up while they're in the middle of working on things may not be the best time for them to read it. There's limited search capabilities because you are absolutely relying on their email inboxes. So whether they deleted that news, maybe you have some really strict retention policies at your organization as well that doesn't let you keep anything in there for more than 6 months. So then you only know the past 6 months history of company news. There's no ability to fix errors. And if you're anything like me, there's that one moment where you're like, oh, and it said there was going to be an attachment and you have to have that embarrassing follow-up, or there's a typo or a broken link. Often you might get a lot of questions after you send out that piece of news and realize there was maybe some additional content that you should have had in that article that would better support and answer these questions. Well, that email's already gone, so my only option is just to keep this thread going and adding more content, but that content is a little bit separated from that original message. And there's no integration across Microsoft 365. So if people are going to the intranet and then going over to their email, they're checking multiple places, which can be really challenging. Some of the things I love about SharePoint News is that it centralizes your internal and external news. So of course, when we're looking at this long list of all of the different items, some of the things that when you're curating your own internal news, right, you can fix those errors, you can add that content. Of course, it's integrated in Microsoft 365. We'll talk a little bit about page analytics. There's things like comments on the pages. The news is always there until you delete it, so you have tons of that organizational memory. So you can curate this rich internal news on these SharePoint pages, but you can also take some external news sources, use those URLs and add them into your news. So now we have both. So I've worked with a couple of companies where they have things like press releases and maybe they're a public company and you have some big announcement. There was the expectation that people would check the external website and the intranet. You don't need to do that. You can highlight the key external news right here in context. You can also create news digests. So it's not just these individual SharePoint pages. You can roll up news across sites, make them into digest, which is kind of like the SharePoint version of a newsletter. And you can even email that out. So you can still create that newsletter to an email inbox that people are familiar with, but have all of those other added benefits of being able to continue working on your content and adding to it as needed. News posts can be made from any site. And in our modern SharePoint world, I'm sure we're all kind of sick of this slide. It's been around for a few years now, right? Where when we came out with that flat information architecture of sites and hubs, we decentralized that content model. So this is what's recommended for how you're structuring your intelligent intranets. And decentralizing your news ensures that the freshest updates are being shared immediately across your organization without the delay of going through this traditional centralized review of, I have news in my department, it goes over to HR or CorpCom, they review it, and once monthly these things get announced. If I have the ability to post news the moment that it happens, people can get those more timely updates, act faster, and impact their behavior a little bit quicker. This is an inherent shift in how companies traditionally share their news. So we'll talk a bit more later about creating governance around news to ensure it's consistent across departments so you can really support all of these new content authors in this decentralized model. The value of your news will also increase with the number of groups curating your news. So what we have here is just a little image for Metcalfe's law, which states that the value of a network is equal to the number of nodes squared. So the more connections you have, the greater value of that network. I remember when I was the first one of my friends who got a cell phone, and when me and one other friend had a cell phone, it really wasn't fun or right? Because everyone else would be out, we couldn't contact them. We still followed those older processes of how we planned ahead before we were out and about. But now that everybody has a cell phone, we've all inherently shifted how we're communicating, what the expectations are around showing up in times, things like that. So as you shift to have SharePoint news and have all of the groups sharing SharePoint news, it becomes a lot more valuable, and your intranet suddenly becomes this central resource for all news instead of a combination of SharePoint, email, your external website, and whatever else you might be using. So this is all a lot of value proposition of how great and easy it is. So I'm going to start real early with a demo, and this is for illustration purposes only, just to see this value of how quick we can actually make a news page and embed content in it. So from the home page, we're just going to hit new news post. I'm going to go pretty quick and get blank. I name my news post based off of what I want the headline of my news to be. And then I can start dropping in some text. Now, when I'm bringing over this text, some of the things that I'm thinking about are, which we'll talk about later, is how to best structure this so people can consume it in a way that matches reading patterns for the web. As I'm going down this page, you'll see I'm quickly adding in some different sections and page layouts. I'm not locked to one straight linear format, and I have the ability to use all SharePoint web parts because under the covers, a SharePoint news page is just a SharePoint page. So all those awesome web parts that come out of the box, and even some of the ones that you can add from groups like PNP, you can still use in these news posts. So this news post, we're spending about 3 minutes to make it. You would likely spend more time on it proportional to the importance of your content to get this looking perfect. So I will admit, as we're adding in our little market schedule here, the perfectionist in me, I was talking with Hugo about it, it's a little unproportional. It's not balanced on the page. Depending on how important your news is, you're going to spend different amounts of time making sure that people have that great experience. Because at the end of the day, the aesthetic usability principle cites that users often perceive aesthetically pleasing design as design that's more usable. And SharePoint provides us this beautiful canvas to create this engaging news, which we're going to be exploring as I rapidly add in images here. So for example, this news post that we're making right now is all about a market in Mexico, and we work at Quintoso Travel. So showing all of the images of the souvenirs that you can buy at this market is really critical to how I'm explaining this message, because I'm trying to teach all of my travel agents what you can go see and why this is such a good spot for their clients to go. And then as we're going down the page, I'm adding in a little history. So maybe they know what started Bazaar Sabado and why some of their clients that are maybe interested in the history of the city would want to go here. You can add a lot of images to your page itself. Hugo will talk about that later in some of the better practices. And you can also just add it to your page banner, which is what we're doing right now. So starting your page with an image right from a web search within SharePoint that really shows this area well so people know what they're going to go see. And then there we go, posted news where I have the history, the location, the schedule, some images of what you're going to see. I can even go in and change that page thumbnail, which will show differently on my homepage. And changing that thumbnail gives me the ability to have a different page banner and a little different teaser image. So maybe you want to communicate this news post a little bit differently in your roll-ups. So just as a lightning fast example of all of the different things you can do so quickly. I mentioned that under the cover, SharePoint news are just SharePoint pages. Well, good news. If you realize that you have a lot of actually dynamic content, not these static pages, you can just promote these SharePoint pages into news. So instead of keeping those as static links, you can begin using that SharePoint news web part immediately. So let's take a peek at this current page. We just click promote at the top and then post as news on site. In the site pages library, essentially what that's doing is changing it to promoted state 2 so that that web part knows to pull it. And I can even send it as an email, whether someone asked me a question and missed that news post, or whether I'm working on that change management of bringing that news to someone where they're already used to consuming it. I also mentioned that you can add in these news links from external sources. So your company may be sharing a lot of that news externally that's important for employees to see now. Instead of recreating it on your intranet, let's say we had that press release and there was a PDF, you don't need to then make another copy and add it in your intranet. You can just grab that link from an external place and put it into your SharePoint news. It has the same look and feel in the roll-up of the web part, so it still feels like your news, but instead it opens in a new tab so your colleagues can consume that content without losing their place on the intranet. So let's take a peek at some news from this week. We found on the San Francisco Gate. We did a little pass over of the news, felt pretty good, grab the link. So now instead of news post, we do news link. It opens in a little dialog box on the right side of our window. And it's pretty darn smart. It already grabbed that preview image, title, and description. But what I want to do is I want to edit my description and put it into context of maybe why my audience is interested in this external news article. So whether it be your company's news that's external or even just news about your industry that you want to bring into your intranet, you have the ability to grab these articles, explained to your coworkers why this is incredibly important, and then post it right there in the web part. The web part's going to automatically show the most recent news at the top. So you'll see our little bizarre Sabado story just got a little smaller because this is our latest piece of news and this is now our most important. But who's coming to the intranet to see this news? Our employees are used to getting it delivered to their inbox.
That's
What
a
do you
very
think,
good.
Hugo?
That's a very good question. So let's start with a myth, right? I often get clients that will say, "Oh, it's easy. I'm just going to put my news on SharePoint or on my intranet or whatever platform they want to use, and then I'm going to force everyone to go to my homepage. That's how I'm going to make sure that everybody sees my news." And I'm going to deploy a policy that's going to force everyone's, homepage on their browser to be my news page. Guess what? When you try to do something like this, you're basically educating your employees, your users, to treat your news like a banner, right? Those annoying banners that we see on websites. You're just teaching them to completely ignore and dismiss. And the first thing they'll do when they open the browser, if you force them to make your news page the home page, is they've learned super quickly to close that tab. It just becomes second nature. So the secret to getting news to your users, your employees, is to make sure, first of all, that you create news that they care about, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But the other way to do it is to reach the employee where they are. So one of the ways that you can do that is with the SharePoint start page. The SharePoint start page automatically, by default, if you create news articles or you create pages and you promote them as news, regardless of what site or site collection you're creating them from, they will automatically roll up for each user, and they will appear on their start page. Now that's important because instead of creating news that are generic for everyone, if I belong to a specific group, let's say I belong to the manufacturing group and the health and safety committee, maybe I get news that are important to me that are related to health and safety and manufacturing, but some other areas like accounting and HR are not relevant to me because I'm not part of the accounting team or the HR team. But there's also maybe some corporate news that I want to share, and those news are also rolled up. So it's kind of like creating a different newspaper for every single person that serves your SharePoint environment. The other way that we can reach people is through the SharePoint mobile app. So when you create your SharePoint news, they automatically appear in the SharePoint mobile app. And on the screenshot there, you see that little mobile browser has the SharePoint news. And the SharePoint news are actually rendered to be responsive. They always look great. So that's a great approach. Another way to reach your people is to basically to go where they work. And more Microsoft Teams is becoming the place where people work. So your employees might not even know that you're using SharePoint News. They just think that they're getting cool news within Teams. You can do that by using the connector within Teams or by using the news tab within Teams as well. Now, on every site, you can also go to the site and add the news web part. And the news web part allows you to control which news you want or curate maybe which news you want to appear on that site. And again, as Emily showed before, the more you're getting nodes in your network that are collaborating within news, the better it's going to be, the more efficient it's going to be. One thing we have to consider, and if this was an all-day workshop, I would be talking about the difference between data, information, and knowledge. Since this is a quick talk, I'll just explain that the difference between data and information is data is zeros and ones. It means nothing. But when you take data and you put it in context, that's when it starts having a meaning. Now, if I just grab news from all over the place that have no meaning for anybody and I just dump it in one place, it's just data, it's just noise. But if I go to a site related to a specific topic and you're showing me news related to that topic in context of what I'm looking at, that's when it starts having a meaning for me. That's when it's useful, right? I may not care about the latest news about benefits until I actually go to the benefits site, and then maybe that's when I'm interested into the benefits. So another way that Emily demonstrated is that we can send news as email, and we'll also talk about the digests. There's one new thing coming soon, which is the ability to send to Yammer and Teams directly. And then there's another one that I'll show you a preview, which is the ability to show news through the SharePoint app bar. The SharePoint app bar is something that that's been demoed here, so it's a video that I'll show you. But here, this app bar will appear everywhere within SharePoint and within Teams. And you see you have the navigation for your SharePoint structure, you have your sites, and here all the news are rolled up in one place. People will also see their files and things like that. But the great thing about this new SharePoint app bar that's coming soon is that because it is kind of the universal way, the standard and consistent way that people can access navigation, it will become second nature for people to go there. So again, the difference between forcing people to go to one place and training them to ignore completely what you're trying to convey to them versus going to where people are and how they work is a better way to reach your users.
And I'm thinking you might be, judging by your background, Hugo, you might be as excited as I am about that SharePoint home site app that's going to be added to Teams as well. So I know right now we don't have any navigation within Teams, but this will also be available. So again, for all that workforce that's coming out of Teams, this is going to be there as well, which is great.
That's right. Thank you. Well, the other thing to consider is we've talked about putting information in context or putting data in context to make it information, give it a meaning. But the other way that we can make news impactful is by reaching the right audience, right? This is a holy grail in marketing, is to understand who your audience is and to target your messaging to your audience. And SharePoint has the ability to do that. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know about, or they've forgotten about it because for a while, audience targeting was not available on use, but it's get back in, right? And I want to make it clear that audience targeting versus is not security, right? When we're talking about using audience targeting, I'll use an example. I have a client that has a head office in Toronto, and they have offices in Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary. And they're smaller offices, except for the head office, obviously, which is a lot bigger. And the head office has all the cool stuff, right? They always have, well, back when we used to go into the office, they had bake sales and muffins and samosas, and they had all sorts of fun activities, and they had always all sorts of fun stuff. And all the other smaller offices didn't get any of that. But you know, the head office being the head office, they would send broadcast messages to everyone saying, "Hey, everyone, there's muffins in the lunchroom," and it would be really, really annoying to the people who are not in the head office because they're getting these messages that don't apply to them. Now, I'm not saying that the purpose of audience targeting is to stop people from getting messages about muffins in the lunchroom, but it's more about, if you understand who the audience for your message is, you have a better chance of sending them something that's meaningful to them, and you have a better chance of them reading those messages. So to create audience targeting, you just have to enable a few things. So the first thing to do is you actually go to your site content. And you may not know this, but all your news pages are actually stored in the site pages library. So if you go to the site pages settings, you'll see that there's a super secret hidden feature called audience targeting settings. And there's a very complicated button right there. It's a checkbox. You just click on enable audience targeting and click OK. And that's pretty much it, right? So from there, we can go back to the home page. And then if we go to the next slide, now that I've got audience targeting enabled for the library, I just need to go to my news web part and to actually configure that. So to do that, I'll edit the page. So go click edit, and then I go click on the news web part, go to the settings. And again, there's a super complicated option right there, which is enable audience targeting. I know, I feel like I'm giving you pro tips here. The third part is to then go to your, well, after you save the page, obviously, is now if we go to the next area, we'll go to a page. And if you go to, so we'll write the page and then we'll go to page details. And because we've enabled audience targeting, we can now select group names or group email addresses. So here, if I wanted to target something for the IT team members, now you'll notice I can't put a person's name there. I can only target groups and audiences. This is not the old style audiences, which used to have to be compiled and everything. This is really based on your security groups or the teams you belong to. But the great thing about that is once I've enabled audience targeting, when people go to the homepage or that homepage, they will get the news that are really intended for them as opposed to generic news. So now imagine if I was able to create Toronto news versus Calgary news versus Vancouver news, and to be able to target these news for the right people. Now, the reason why I said targeting is not security before is because we don't want to be confused by the fact that I say that this news article is intended for this group of people doesn't mean that other people can't see it. If they search for it or if they browse for it, they'll definitely find those news article. But again, it's more about understanding who we're trying to aim with these pieces of news and making sure that they're brought forward to them. And in fact, later, if we have some time, we'll show you there's some settings that allows you to actually control how we can even highlight news that are targeted for people.
Before we dive into this piece, I just realized, sorry to interrupt you, Hugo, we don't have a chat in here, but I know we're both big fans of inline questions. So if anyone has any questions so far, please do feel free to raise your hand and we're here for you.
Or if chat is not enabled, turn on your video and use interpretive dancing and I'll try to figure out what you're trying to ask.
I would prefer that.
Yes. All right. So one of the things that we can also do, because so far we've talked about how you can create news in every site, right? Every either communication site or team site, and you can really target the members of those sites, and you can bubble these news wherever they are. The challenge is most organizations will say, well, I have my corporate communication team or whatever they're called inside your organization. They're the authoritative source of information for anything that's company news. And I want these news to be treated differently. I want them to be, treated as the official news. So in order to do that, there is a way to go to a news library and to distinguish it as an official company news. Again, because we don't have a lot of time here, we've just posted a short link on the right. If you go to simp.info/org-news, we have the instructions on how to do this. But you'll notice that once we've actually marked a news library as the official or an official news library, it will be labeled with a special tag here so that you can distinguish. So now you can have, let's say, HR news, right, or corporate news that bubble up as the official news. And, to talk about how we can bubble up even more and bring the news to people, I'll pass it on to Emily to talk about News Digest.
So I alluded to it in the beginning when I mentioned we can centralize our internal and external news. And I said you can grab those news posts and news links, put them into a news digest, and then send those out as, think of it as your next generation newsletter. It can be sent to an email, or a distribution list, but on the back end, it's also creating a page. So again, when we're talking about that organizational memory, you're still also creating issues of these newsletters, and you still have these instances of, on December 3rd, we decided this was the most important roll-up of company news for this week. And it helps increase that, again, organizational memory to know what was shared when. So it's really helpful for those new employees to understand some of that recent history for the company, and even more helpful long-term as maybe some roles shift in the organization and different people take on communicating this news. They will have access to the cadence, the type of things that were added, and they can make more informed decisions of which ways are communicating were working and maybe which weren't by having all of that information that was previously shared. So let's take a peek at our news web part. So the first part that I'll call out is the one that we're looking at right now. We're seeing a lot of that organizational travel news. When you're creating your news digest, it will depend what your news web part is set to pull. So if you want to get all company news, make sure that your news web part is set to all sites. You also need to have at least 4 news posts before we get this beautiful little see all button in the top right. I guess the assumption is if you have 1 or 2 news posts, it's too early for a digest. Who knows? Maybe you need to send those by email as you are just getting started out. But let's take a peek. So we start out on the top right with that see all. And then up in the top nav, I can say email and news digest. I can select any non-continuous stories, so I can pick out what's most important. And again, news links and news posts will appear the same. I can pick that individual person or a distribution list to send it to. And similar to when we made our news post, right now when I'm naming my news digest, that's again going to be the name of your SharePoint page. I can drag and sort the order of my stories. So I can also decide hierarchically which I feel should be at the top because it's most important. One of the top questions that I get after this is the Corp Comm team saying, well, we send out these really branded emails. We've been spending all this time in HTML and MailChimp, and we really want it to look like ours. And this just says Microsoft all over it. It doesn't feel like our news. I hear you. Use it as a starting point. What you can do is it's actually making this table, right? And it's shortening your steps. Instead of you spending time getting the correct image, structuring it, grabbing your titles, your teaser text, your authors and dates, it's doing all of that for you. What you can do is then forward that email, right? So then you have your own authoring canvas, delete out all of this stuff. This is just 1 row in a table. And then these are just 2 JPEGs. So you can delete that all out, easy peasy, drop in whatever you want that's really important to your organization. On the back end, the page that's made doesn't have any of this branding up here. So it looks exactly like it just did when we made it. So you still do have a pretty good alignment between what people received in email that's branded to your company with what's on your intranet, because you already have all that branding with your site theme or your site logos, different things like that.
Emily, Scott has a question.
Oh, yes, please.
Now, we can't see it in the chat, Scott. Yeah.
It's okay. Could you push that into Power Automate to strip it and repackage it for the branding part?
You could, yeah.
Okay.
In fact, as I was listening to Emily, I was like, oh, maybe I should build a web part that allows you to brand the news digest or something. But yeah, you could definitely do something like this. It's, as Emily said, it's only a starting point to generating an email that you can then take to a whole new level. Now, I would caution you against, because a lot of people will go crazy and they'll create multiple columns and things like that. And there's all sorts of research that shows that this layout here with a nice high quality picture and a single column layout is probably some of the most efficient layout for email digest. So don't go too crazy in terms of customizing it, but it doesn't hurt obviously to brand it so that people know that this is coming from your organization, not from Microsoft.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of stripping out the top div statement, which has got the Microsoft and the SharePoint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could absolutely do that.
Okay, thanks.
The other piece of why you might want to forward a news digest to yourself is that when you make them, they come from who was the person sending them. So you can see up here in my dev tenant, for some reason, I decided not to capitalize my name. So now it's everywhere. The things we live with. I guess I could just adjust it, but here it says Emily shared the news, right? Maybe I'm not supposed to be the one sharing this news. So, and maybe I don't have access to log into an account to send it from SharePoint. So maybe you just have like an Exchange email inbox that's shared. It's not a full user profile. You could then forward to yourself, change your from, change your subject line. Because I will say this isn't necessarily the most engaging, but part of that is probably because my title also isn't very good. So you want to make sure you have a really engaging, specific call to action title. We all get so many emails. If someone's like news from this week, that's immediately a delete. So please don't copy what I did up here, because this is definitely not enough information sent for everyone to dive into it, which we'll talk about a little more later. So now that we understand why we would like to leverage news and how to create the pages themselves, let's talk a little bit about conveying your messages.
Awesome. So a wise person once told me that to communicate is to convey a message that results in a change in behavior. Now, I don't think that I fully appreciated what they were telling me when they first told me about this. But since then, I've learned to truly appreciate what this means, right? So if you're just sending tons of messages or creating tons of news and things like that, and you don't understand what you want people to do from that, right? You don't understand what change in behavior you want them to do from your message, then you're not communicating. You're just making noise. And there's no amount of using SharePoint news or technology that's going to fix that. But so that's why we're going to spend a lot of time to help you understand that concept, right? To really force yourself to say, okay, well, what is the change that I want my employees to do, right? Or my team members to do? Maybe the change in behavior is I want them to go from not knowing about this to knowing about this. But that's probably not the most impactful change in behavior, right? You probably want people to, I don't know, go do their annual employee sign off, right? The change in behavior is you want them to do that, and that's the message you're trying to convey. So try to understand, what do I want my folks, my employees to do, and then you'll make it a lot easier to communicate, to convey a message.
And when you're structuring that message, you want to consider how writing for the web is so different than the way that we write for print. People scan and move really quickly. They've done, Nielsen Norman Group has done eye tracking studies, and it's about 20 to 28% of the page that they actually read. That's pretty terrifying for anyone who's part of marketing and corp comms on the phone, who just spent hours creating this huge article, and you're realizing that people are only reading a fifth of it. So when you're structuring your message, you want to make sure that you're writing in this inverted pyramid style. And what this does is it ensures that the most critical point is at the top of the page, with progressive disclosure as you go more into detail down the page. So that means that someone gets that top point once they land on your page. They can decide, this matters to me, I need to read this now, this is relevant, and continue to dive deeper. Or maybe they see the overview and it's like, this is really about engineering, I don't have with them. This is nice. I'll flag it for later, but it's not a critical thing I need to read before I go to my next meeting. And it just gives that site visitor that understanding of the primary topic, even if they were briefly there, because we're all hopping around across our intranet as we have these competing priorities. So when you write in these inverted pyramids, it's going to match those web reading patterns. So your first step is to identify those key points. As Hugo mentioned, you want to be thinking about what the intention is, who my audience is. So this is really the point where I'm making that user needs statement of who's reading this, what do they actually need to do, what do I need to tell them, what change in behavior do I need? Rank what's secondary, what maybe isn't as critical. That's what you're going to be putting further and further down the page. Write well and concisely. I mean, of course, we all know write well because your whole audience is going to be reading it, but also concise is really critical since people aren't reading all of the words in that sentence. And Hugo, I think you have a good fact about that number of words people are reading on this one.
Yes, in average, people will read the first two words of a paragraph, or an average of 11 characters. So if you have a tendency to write all your news, let's say you work for Contoso, and you write all your news starting with Contoso Inc. blah blah blah, Contoso Inc. blah blah blah. Guess what? They're not seeing the blah 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 part. All they see is Contoso Inc., Contoso Inc., Contoso Inc. So we'll talk about how you can change the structure a little bit to carry the most impactful words at the start of your sentence.
And to that point, you want to front load all of those elements to make sure that they get that content. You might also want to consider adding a short summary, like a key messages in the top right with a couple of bullets or something like that. So again, if it is a more dense article and you are covering a lot of content and it is all critical because you went through it and you determined that, give them a little summary on the right. One of my favorite tricks is to use those different text styles, and you change your text from like heading to heading 1 or heading 2, and they are actually anchor links. Use those anchor links in your summary so someone can jump down further into the article as well. So let's talk a little bit more about page structure.
So your page structure will absolutely, I have a picture of a house of cards here, but your page structure is something that's very fragile. It can either fall apart or it can really be the sturdiest thing, and it really depends on how you create your page structure. It will affect whether people read. One thing we have to understand is there's something called reading gravity, or Gutenberg's rule, right? Which says that we read, or at least in this part of the world, we read top to bottom, left to right. And understanding that and laying out your page so that we're able to predict where people will look or influence where people will look will actually help convey the message. And this is something that we'll talk about when we talk about eye gazing. And then the concept that Emily was talking about of using headings and things like that to create hyperlinks, anchors in your page, but also to create a visual distinction will also help. So let's go a bit deeper into this. And I kind of feel like on the next, I kind of feel like I'm the bad news person today, because I'm telling you all the things you don't want to hear. But I often hear my clients saying, "Oh, yeah, my employees love my news. They can't wait to read my news," right? And I ask them, "Well, okay, how many people actually read your news?" And they say, "Well, I don't know. I email them to everybody, but most people open the email, right? But you still don't know whether your employees are going in to read your news." Well, guess what? Your employees don't care about your news, unfortunately. It's not that they really, like, they're trying to be evil and they're saying, ha ha ha, I will ignore what you're saying. But your employees all have a job to do, right? They have better things to do. You're probably measuring them on doing their jobs, right? And you may think, well, they should read my company news. It's part of their job. But research shows that people don't read on computer screens the same way they read on paper. So whereas you may have had great success by creating a printed piece of paper and giving it to people and they would read it, that's not how we read online. And the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we can correct that behavior from your users by adapting your page structure and break those unhealthy reading habits that your users have. And there's research by Nielsen Norman, again, that says that if we make some of these changes that we're going to be suggesting, you can get to 124% better usability in how people read your news. So let's talk about some of those things. This is probably one of my favorite research that's ever been done. It's the F-shaped reading pattern. And so the way they've done this is they actually used infrared cameras and they shot infrared lights in people's eyes, and then they recorded where people were looking. And then they superimposed that on pieces of web pages. And they found that much to everyone's dismay, people tend to read in an F shape. They'll look at the line. You may notice that people are not even looking at, oh, by the way, the parts that are brighter and closer to red are hotter, and that means that people have looked at those things longer or more often. And the parts that are not highlighted or very lightly highlighted were parts that people didn't look at. So you'll notice that people don't look at things like the headings. They don't even look at ads or things that could be considered as banners, which will be relevant when we start talking about adding pictures. But you'll even notice that that picture of the whatever that is, that's a tiger or a big kitty. People don't pay attention to that. But look at how much or how little of the page people looked at, right? The people barely looked at the first paragraph. And again, you'll see they only look at the first little part of the paragraph. And then they go down a little bit, they read a little bit more, they go down, they skip a whole bunch of parts of the paragraph, but they always read kind of the first little part of the paragraph, and then they keep on scrolling. Eventually, they just give up. Now, understanding that, again, people are not, like I said, people are not trying to be evil, right? They're trying to maximize or minimize, I guess, their interaction cost and minimize the benefit they get from reading the work. So the scanning is really motivated by the employee's motivation. They have a goal that they're trying to achieve, and if they don't get what they want, they're going to quickly skip. And in some cases, like people, I mean, in all cases, people will get bored and they'll just give up. But over the time, like the words that they read, if the words don't offer a lot of information, or what they like to call giving a weak information scent, your employees might not get enough gratification and they might not continue reading. So when people scan in F shape, they really, really, really miss big chunks of your content. And again, if you say, no, my articles are going to be so amazing that everyone's going to want to read every single word of it, I promise you probably the only people that are reading every single word of it are probably the people in your communication team that's their job to read every single word of it. And I was kind of giggling a little bit because every time in maybe less professional settings, every time that I think about the F-shaped reading pattern, I can just think of a mouth making the F letter. So someone who's about to say a really bad word, and that's really what your reaction should be when you realize how very little people are reading your pages. That's why it's really called the F-shaped reading pattern. All right. So now there is an antidote. And the antidote is to create a page structure. So on the page on the right here, I don't even think that's a SharePoint page, and it really doesn't matter, right? One of the things, and I want to point out, this is a pretty long page with lots of information, but you'll notice that they're doing a few interesting things, right? The first thing that they're doing is that they're including the most important points in the first two paragraphs of the page. Now, you can't see that. And I can't see that either, but you just have to believe me. That's really what they're doing. Again, people read. You saw how people scan. So the most important points in the first two paragraphs of the page are, and this is where Emily was talking about creating a summary or a TLDR, right? Too long, didn't read, is one good way to get people the information they need. Emily talked about the concept of progressive disclosure. And that means to progressively disclose or show more information as your users are telling you that they want to see it. So if you put all the most important stuff at the top, and then below that you put the more fluffy stuff like all the stats and all the proof and all the stuff that they might not necessarily care about, if they're interested, they can continue reading. But if they give up after the first two paragraphs, they'll still get the gist of what you're trying to say. So the other thing that you can do is use headings and subheadings. So this is something that we see in that screenshot. Headings and subheadings, they help people understand that we're entering into a new area of content. And they look more important, right? Because they're usually bolder and brighter and more visible. And so people will distinguish them more quickly. Always start your headings and your subheadings with the words carrying the most information. Again, if your users only see the first two words, they should really get the gist of what your headings mean. So that, again, don't do the whole Contoso Inc., right? Contoso Inc. announces new employee benefits. That's not going to work. New employee benefits or employee benefits is probably a better way to do this. You also want to visually group small amounts of related content together. And you see that, again, it really doesn't matter that you can't read the content on the screen, because you can just, by looking at the page, you can see that there's buckets of information, there's headings that are visually distinguishable, and that's really what it's all about. Don't be afraid to bold important words and phrases. Now, when everything's important, nothing's important. So don't bold everything or don't highlight everything, because then you're getting the reverse. But certainly don't be afraid to, don't leave it up to your readers to make an assumption, right? So if you want them to understand a very important point, don't be ashamed. You can actually highlight it for them and tell them this is the most important thing. Also, one of my favorite tricks, take advantage of formatting of links, right? Links always show up differently, and we're kind of trained to want to click on them and highlight them. So take advantage of that, but please, and this is probably a whole hour conversation here, but don't use generic words for your links, right? Use information-bearing words. So don't say go, click here, more, right? This is so 1990. It's not even funny, right? Make it so that if people look at the link, it's telling them what this link is going to do. And Emily is going to talk about that later, so I'm not going to steal that from her. But it certainly improves the accessibility for users, especially if someone's using a screen reader, right? When, I don't know if you've ever looked at or listened to someone who's using a screen reader when they read the internet, but the screen reader will quickly scan through all the links on the page. And if you're using things like go, click here, or more, all they'll hear is click here, click here, click here, click here, right? And that's not the effect that you want. Another thing you want to do is use bullets and numbers. We love to use bullets. We love to actually scan for those bullets. And if you're looking at that page, your eyes are probably drawn to the various little buckets of information that are bullets. The other thing that bullets can do is probably the next point, which allows you to cut the unnecessary content. And I actually removed the word here on purpose because you really don't need it, right? When you write using bullets, you kind of force yourself to not write in a full sentence. It just becomes, I don't know, it just becomes against your nature to write to write long sentences when you use bullets. So take advantage of bullets. That's a great way to force yourself to be more concise. Another thing that we can look at is the Gestalt principle. Now, it's not a new diet. It's a principle called the principle of common regions. And basically what it says is that items that are grouped within a boundary are perceived as a group, and they're assumed to share some common characteristics or functionality. So this is an example here of a standard page template. And you'll notice that it is actually visually grouping some elements by using either blocks of color, by using images, or by using headings and spacing. So use background colors, spacing, and borders to help group information. That's going to help break that F-shaped pattern that people are doing by actually attracting them, because we're always attracted to shapes, to colors, to motion, and things like that. So on the next page, I have a really embarrassing, boring page here. That's just a wall of text, right? This is probably the worst thing to do to our users. But you may not know that if you create a section in a page, you can actually go to that section settings and you can go click on the background color. And if this was a better written article and I was to zoom out of that page, you'd be able to actually see that there's now visual sections in that page that I can highlight from. In fact, if we go to the next slide, there's a wonderful site called lookbook.microsoft.com. If you haven't used it, I don't think we can be friends anymore. Lookbook.microsoft.com is probably one of the most useful resources, especially for me as a consultant, because when I need to put together a demo, I just go there, I grab something quickly. They make extensive use of the Gestalt principle for their design. They use colors, they use dividers, they use images and headings extensively, and it looks great. And again, it bears to repeat that news pages in SharePoint are just regular SharePoint pages that have been promoted.
One of my favorite parts about the lookbook as well is that you can actually install those sites into your tenant and then play around and edit with them. So, and they also in the lookbook have links to each of the web parts and tell you what they used. So you can also come up to speed if you're like, oh, I didn't think of that web part, of using it that way or in that format. So it's really helpful. So after you get super inspired by that lookbook, we had talked a little bit about some ways that we can maybe instill some of this governance, because now we have all these decentralized content authors. So it's time to think about maybe some page templates following these best practices and guiding your new authors, your new content authors through how to curate news. In these page templates, you can even put in descriptions, like in the first paragraph layout section, make this your most important point. You can link to articles that help support and educate them as well for that in-context learning. You're removing that friction for them to even learn for themselves about how to write this excellent news. Using page templates also creates consistency in how information is structured across all of these different departments. So you're reducing the need to relearn where to find critical information for all of those colleagues consuming this news. And that's one of the top concerns that I hear from those marketing and corp comm teams is, well, news is going to look entirely different. If you give some governance guardrails, some education, and some training for all of these different subject matter experts that don't have a background in communication and likely don't know these principles, you're going to be able to set them up for better success with this. When you're making these page templates, which we'll look at next, they are in a site collection only. So if you're going to be trying to make page templates and moving them across your environment, you're going to have to consider a couple of different tools. Things like third-party migration tools to copy the page to other sites if you are a non-developer. I'm a huge fan of ShareGate. If you are more comfortable with development, you can't do anything right now like site designs. It doesn't support the page layout, but PMP provisioning templates do. I am very much a non-dev and identify myself as someone who specializes in out of the box for creating user experiences. And I have been having a fantastic time dangerously playing around with PMP provisioning templates. So it is possible. There's a lot of support and resources out there. Of course, we don't have enough time to go over that today. So we're just going to do our brief out of the box example, but do at the end if we want to talk and chat about that a little bit more. It's really powerful. So let's take a peek at making one of these page templates. So here is my incredibly basic news template. Again, spend a little bit more time on this to align with the guidelines that you create in your organization. And like all governance, hopefully you're doing that in partnership with the organization, not to them, because it's important to understand their needs. And now that I have this beautiful page created for me, what I can do is go up to this top section and in that dropdown, select Save Template, and I can give it any kind of title, which will show when I make those new pages in the future. You can also go to your site pages library. There's now going to be a folder there called templates, and you can continually edit these templates as you learn more about the best ways to consume news in your organization. So let's take a peek at what that actually looks like when we're using this page template to create consistency and how to find that key information across all of our different sites. We'll click that new dropdown and then news post, and we'll see here we have this whole new section right here, news template. I can go view the templates folder, but I can also live preview what that page looks like right there on the right, which is pretty darn cool. So people can see what it is before they dive in and create that news. Now, Hugo made an incredibly useful tool for maybe some of your non-technical users to begin exploring these layouts outside of SharePoint.
Me to talk about it? I
Yes,
can talk
please.
about it. It feels like a shameless promotion. So yeah, a while ago I created these wireframes. The challenge is everybody who wants to create wireframes has to buy special tools, and and then you can't share these wireframes with anybody. So I created a series of PowerPoint series of PowerPoint slides and PowerPoint masters that you can use to create your own little SharePoint wireframes. They are designed to look wiggly with a wiggly font and things like that, so that people don't look at it and say, "Oh yeah, okay, this is exactly what my new page design is going to look like." It's really the intention here is to convey kind of this is what the structure is going to look like. So it's got a template. It's got all this is one example here of a template where it's got all the positioning for the column layouts, and you can pick how many columns you want and everything. So you can get to that by going to the GitHub site, Hugo A. Bernier /SharePoint wireframes. And I'm always happy to add more wireframes. So it's a great way for you to design those page layouts and to share that with your stakeholders.
And one of the best things about it, right, is so often you make this page, you have this structure, but you picked the wrong darn image. And that's what the whole meeting talks about for 45 minutes, right? Or they debate the text color. And having those squiggly edges clearly communicates how informal it is. So Nielsen Norman Group actually recommends using these low fidelity wireframes when you're kind of having those initial conversations. Of course, you don't need to do that for every piece of news that you make. Maybe use these in the beginning when you're communicating with stakeholders about that structure of the governance of those page templates you want to make.
That's a very good point.
And while you're making all of those different layouts, since I mentioned images, we have a lot of great tips from Hugo on maybe the best ways to use those in our news.
Thank you. So you saw that Emily in her templates has a lot of really cool images, and images can be very powerful, but they can also be very disruptive. So let's talk about what kind of images to use and how to use them. So there's two types of images right out there. There's decorative images and information carrying images. Decorative images, they make your pages look pretty, but they also tend to push the information down the page. They do have value. Don't take from me saying that decorative images are bad. They have value, right? They can support your brand, they can support the tone of voice, but you really have to be careful about not to overdo it to the point where people can't get to the actual content. On the other hand, information carrying images convey information, like a product image for a product that you sell or a person's photo that will add a lot of value to users. If you're talking about someone, showing that person will help. And there's all sorts of research that shows that when people identify someone as their peers, so they say, hey, I work with this guy, right? And this is someone I like. They have a tendency to actually absorb that person's knowledge or be willing to listen to that person's knowledge more than if it's just an unknown person. So take advantage of that. And it's important to know that people tend to treat generic images like banner ads, and they'll completely ignore them. As you saw in the heat map, the eye tracking chart that we saw earlier, they just completely didn't look at the kitty and they didn't look at the ads. But they will actually pay closer attention to real images. So when they see someone they recognize, you put a picture of your CEO there, your smiling employees there, they will actually recognize it and they will pay attention to it. Now, pay attention to where you put that image on the page, because if there are people on the page, people will actually pay attention to what those people are doing. So here's an example. We have Mark Anderson here. A lot of you probably know him, and that's why I used him instead of some generic, less good-looking supermodel. But look at where Mark is looking, right? That's not good. In fact, little known fact, Mark has a superpower. He can actually start small fires with his eyes. But anyways, if you actually flip this image around, look at what happens. You have a tendency, you probably, when you saw this image move, you probably followed his eyes and his finger, and you probably had a tendency to go look back at the title of this page. Be careful how you use images. So this is a great trick. I mean, it's used in advertising all the time. It's used in your supermarket all the time to make you buy more expensive products or make your children bug you to buy sugar-filled cereals. But this is the same principle. Understand how those images influence people. And again, we're not trying to manipulate people. We're trying to just not take away people from the goal we're trying to achieve, right? All right, so let's look at some other concepts here. One of the ideas is the image size guidelines. Now, this is, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's available as a hyperlink, but there are some recommended image sizes. The one thing that I want to point out is if you're using information carrying images, you want to make sure they're high quality images because they potentially convey information, right? Again, if it's an image of the product, you want to encourage people to look at that product, examine it. Even if you want to do 3D images, you can do that. If you're using decorative images, the old way to do things used to be people will take a very cheesy little small image and they'll put it on the page just as a placeholder. That actually tends to distract people and prevent people from wanting to read more. But if you put beautiful, nice, high quality images like the ones that Emily's used, and they're adding value to the overall, in the case of Emily, it's adding value by talking about the place that we're looking at, then people will have a tendency to look at them more. So small images are clutter and distract users. Emily?
And earlier, we were talking a bit about accessibility and screen reading. Don't use images with text because screen readers won't pick those up. So make sure you put those captions in. Think about that varied audience that you have.
That's a very good point. I can't believe I forgot about that. And also,
I'm here for you.
Also high contrast, right? And if you do use images and it's the only way that you're conveying images, keep in mind that you should put alternate text behind the images so that if someone can't see the image, they should at least understand what the image is about.
So let's dive in our last section about getting the results that you want. So we talked about why news, how to structure that content so you can convey these great messages. And now this is the bit where we're talking a little bit more about that change in behavior that Hugo is mentioning. So one of my favorite things to talk about is information foraging. So it's this idea similar to animal foraging where they're looking for food and an animal wants to spend as little calories as possible to get that nutrient that they need. So they're really looking for this scent and they're following these strong scents. The stronger it gets, the more likely their food's there, the more confident they are they're going to go down this path. Their little animal calories are being used effectively. Awesome. Whenever I think of this, I'm always imagining a truffle pig. I don't know about you. One of my favorite things is truffle oil. So now when we think about information foraging, it's what Hugo was alluding to earlier about information scent. So just like those truffle pigs looking for their tasty treat, I am an employee and I am looking for some critical information on benefits and those titles that are front-loaded and concise and specific make me more and more confident that that's what I want. So those great news headlines that are really clear about what's going to be in that article means I'm going to click on it and open it. So when we're thinking of that, we have this little calculation on the bottom. It's this idea that the more cost associated with that information is decreasing that rate of gain. So how do we actually implement that? One way is to help decrease that cognitive effort, right? That's the currency. That's the calories that we're spending for our colleagues as they're trying to consume this news. We've talked a lot about how all of these colleagues have their own jobs and they're incredibly busy. They're not lazy, they're just overloaded. So they don't necessarily spend the time on this news that they would like to. So we're communicating this piece of news for an action item or a change in behavior. Why don't we just embed that content into the page or directly link to it to remove that friction and that cognitive effort to go find it later so that the next step is right there in the context of the page. So let's take a peek, for example, at using that file viewer web part. Let's say we had that press release that was a PDF that we shared, or here at Contoso Travel, we're trying to talk a little bit more about the road to HANA and make sure we share that with our organization. I embedded it right there in the page instead of putting a link to it. It's an incredibly strong information sent because I might have a description above and then it's right there below. I see that in my scroll and I'm like, ooh, that's a little teaser. I definitely want to go consume that. Sometimes it won't make sense to fully embed something into a page, or maybe you can't. So let's look at some of our other options. Hugo mentioned earlier that law of common regions. So we do want to keep that in mind when we're structuring those next steps. So let's say we're going back to this new excursion offering for Bazaar Sabado. You can see we got a little bit feedback on our page structure that those images were a little extraneous. So we took those out. We used a little bit of the content chunking with our headers. We also added in a section background for the history of Bazaar Sabado to show that it's very separate from this conversation of why we want to target it to our clients. We're talking about why I want to target to the clients on the left, and we used a 1/3 column on the right to put in a call to action web part because all of the people at Contoso Travel need to take a training so they can fully understand these excursions before they talk about it with their clients. So here I am, I popped in my great little call to action web part. It has a background and it does have that site theming in the button, and it's pretty visually heavy, which is good in this scenario because I do want anyone reading this piece of news, this next action to be to sign up for that excursion training. But do remember that this link is also a promise. If I'm telling you sign up for excursion training, I better not drop you on that training homepage where you have to then go find excursion training because I'm not removing the friction and I'm still not helping that cognitive load at all. I might lose you at that point. There's a law in user experience called the peak end rule, where people remember how they felt at the beginning and the end of a task. You just did all of this amazing work focusing on how to make this great news. You have your inverted pyramid, you did your whole page structure, and then you dropped them somewhere where they had to spend a lot of effort to find the next step. What a bummer that you just lost their engagement from a bad link. That's such a shame. Another way to show some of this content or link to it is just a button. And how many people have seen this before? I know Hugo was alluding to it earlier. So beach, learn more. City, learn more. Wilderness, learn more. Not only do those screen readers not really capture the context of what that is, but there are some people who have visual spatial processing challenges. So again, think of that wider audience. It also doesn't support any of that information foraging with my whole truffle pig mentality. I want to find out something great about the beach. So what if we change these labels? Now beaches get some sun. That's very specific to the beach, and it brings out that visceral feeling of it beating down on me and my little beads of sweat as I enjoy some kind of tiki cocktail, right? Or a city, take in some culture. I'm going to go to some museums or, maybe some Broadway shows, things like that. What we used here were the 4 S's for encouraging clicks. The first one is specific. We talked a lot about avoiding generic language and jargon. So we're really specific about what that thing is that I'm going to gain by clicking on that link. Again, we're sincere, deliver on that link promise. If I'm saying beach, get some sun, I can't just drop you somewhere that is going to be an all excursions overview page. You do need to be substantial enough to differentiate it. So before, right, learn more, no differentiation. And then all of these things I just asked you to do, can you also be succinct? Because people aren't really reading so many of those words. So we want to make sure we're not losing them in those eye tracking patterns and how quickly they're glossing over content. So think of those 4 things together when you're creating these links to these next steps of content to make sure you don't lose them in the end. So today we showed you how to easily leverage SharePoint to make more impactful news that successfully conveys your messages and gets the results you want by reducing friction for those end users. I know that was a lot of content, so I'll leave up this resources slide. But do we have any questions from the group? We love cameras on and hands up, and would love to hear your thoughts. Scott?
Is there any ability to schedule the posts now for the pages going live?
Ooh, I know they announced it, and I would have to double check my dev tenant to see if that is available. I knew for a while it was coming soon. Hugo, it looks like you might be checking that in the back end.
I am.
Fabulous.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. So I
don't
heard
think
it
I've seen
about
mine.
6 months ago, but
The other things we didn't touch on that are coming soon that I'm super psyched about are time to read, so that it'll automatically calculate and show right under your title and author how long it's going to take someone to read this article. Not only a great tool for me as a colleague to say, wow, that's a 15-minute article. I'm not going to fit that in before my meeting, but an even better tool for the person writing that article. No one's reading your 15-minute article. If this is a weekly update, make it 2 minutes to read, 3 minutes to read. Use that as a tool to help you shorten those sentences, use those bullets, make it a little bit more consumable.
It's like every blog post that I write.
An hour later. And I guess, Hugo and I, while we were making this presentation, we talked a lot about it, where I feel like a lot of my interest in writing in the web is I'm still practicing and getting better at it too. And it's constantly changing and shifting. So this is one of those things where spending more time, you'll find you get better, get to know your audience a little better. You'll be able to target them. So don't put that pressure that right out of the gate, you're going to have the best news story and the highest engagement. Really stay close to your user base, get a lot of feedback, have conversations, find out what's working for them. Because at the end of the day, this news is really for them, not necessarily for you.
I think there's one trick that I would encourage people to avoid. We have a tendency, when we're trying to be fun and interactive, we have a tendency to write everything as a question, right? Would you like to know more about benefits, right? And don't do that. It's just in your head, it just creates a more cognitive load, because now it's a conversation where someone's asking you and you're answering and you're going back and forth. Just go straight out and just create a call to action. Like you saw the buttons that Emily created, go get some sun, go do this, go do that. You're not ordering people, you're just encouraging people, let's go do this, let's have fun, right? So that really will change the tone of your messages, and it will drastically increase engagement.
A giant thank you to the Granite State user group for having us and letting us talk a ton about one of our favorite topics.
And yet we've barely scratched the surface, it feels.
True. Well, Hugo and I said we should do a whole day, maybe.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emily and Hugo. It was great to have you today. I really appreciate you coming out.
I mean, it was a really long commute from my desk, but I'm willing to do it for you, Derek.
Thank you. So much love, so much love.
And I bet you didn't know that fact about Mark Anderson.
Oh, that he could blow up things with his eyes?
Yeah,
Well,
now we work with him, so yeah.
I've been avoiding it thus far. We'll see.
Oh, Mark was here.
I don't think he was there the moment it happened, which is
oh
such
man.
No, he didn't know that he was in there. So there's always that fun big reveal when you tease your coworkers while it's being recorded and posted on the internet.
There's no chat, right?
There is no chat.
Okay, good. I just didn't know if I was not in the secret club or something.
So I guess if anybody has any more questions, feel free to come off mute and say what you've got to say. Also, if he has any suggestions on what to, on any future topics that they'd like to hear about, we're scheduling up folks for next year. It's hard to think that we're even saying that now, but it's December, so we're scheduling folks into next year for these sessions. So you can either reach out to Jim or myself if you come up with something after the fact, or oh wait, we have Carla. You want to say hi? And
yep,
go ahead.
Hey, so
oh, Naveen, I'm sorry, I read it wrong.
Yep. Hey, Derek.
Hi.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, are there any interesting things as far as mobile app is concerned to take note of for the news feature?
So the mobile app is the only one that does give you push notifications. That's another top question that I get is like, how can I kind of push this news to my employees? I'd say that's one of the top items. The other thing just to consider, and it's more mobile and like going across devices, not necessarily the app specific, is to test out your responsive pages. So if you use, for example, like a vertical column on your page, that doesn't stay next to stuff throughout the whole page. It actually drops all content to the bottom. So that would be an example where you might want to use like a 2/3 left, 1/3 right instead. And then when that gets shrunk and responsive, it drops it below. You can actually make news from the mobile app as well, but I will admit I have never tried. I've never been in that situation, but because maybe it'll help you be brief in what you have to say because you don't want to tire out those thumbs.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, everybody can have a great evening or rest of your day, depending on where you happen to be. So,
Is
all
there
right.
any ability to filter the web part against a list item at all, like you can do with document libraries and that?
Oh, you mean like using dynamic properties?
Yes.
I've never tried that.
I've only ever done a site column for news categories before. So sometimes people want to like parse out a subset of their news. It out of the box, it didn't give me as much as I would like because you could really only pick like one filter and it applied to everything. So depending on what your roll up is, it could be a little bit limiting.
Okay. But yeah, I don't think the news web part allows the actual filter from web list or whatever it is.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, unlike the library part, you can actually specify the filter to connect to. I don't think the news part does that, unfortunately.
No.
It's a great idea.
So I'll just have to use a new library part, put the SharePoint pages in there, and use the new card properties.
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing behind the scenes. They, depending on which layout you're using, the film strip is a bit more difficult to use, but it's probably not what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll have a play with that one.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Hopefully the quiet means that everybody enjoyed it, not that everybody's asleep.
If new questions come up, reach out to us on Twitter as well. We're always here to chat about news.
Yes.
All right. Thanks. Have a
Bye,
good night,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.